voted don't mean shit, only guap and guns. We're stuck in the control trap. We're stuck in the control trap. We're stuck in the control trap. Guap and guns, guap and guns. Only way you'll make it to the top, like it or not.
Welcome to the Patriotic Communist. This is Max Rice, and this is the podcast where I advocate for a socialist revolution in the United States of America, and where I analyze current events from a far-left perspective. We are in the historical context where we choose socialism or barbarism, and that has never been more true. In this episode, I talk about the Wisconsin primary, the COVID-19 pandemic, and Bernie Sanders dropping out of the Democratic primary for President of the United States. I will end the show with discussing the inherent violence of capitalism. Just like last week, this will be an episode where a majority of the time is taken up by current events. So the first story that I have to talk about today is a Wisconsin primary for the Democratic nominee for the President of the United States of America. So Wisconsin had more than 2,500 confirmed cases of COVID-19, and the Democrats still held this election. This was such an obvious threat to public safety that many poll workers quit. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin, they went from 180 polling places to just 3. Yes, you heard me right. They went from 180 voting locations to only 3. You can't make this shit up. Not only does that massively increase the crowds that will show up by decreasing efficiency, but it also blatantly suppresses unprecedented amounts of voters. Just the fact that they're holding this primary during a pandemic makes it so that people with underlying conditions or people who are especially old are being told to either keep democracy alive or keep themselves alive. And while everyone else is being asked, whether or not they want to help keep democracy alive or keep their health. And the lack of voting locations is an extremely blatant act of voter suppression in its own right. This isn't fucking democracy. This is disgusting. A lot of people are going to die because of these elections and because of these decisions to keep having these elections, and I'm honestly floored. I was already surprised and deeply disturbed by Florida, Illinois, and Arizona continuing to hold their primaries a while ago, but this is absolute insanity. The DNC really had the nerve to insist states not delay their primaries, and they did this by threatening them with delegate power, and this was right after or before primaries on March 17th, after everyone was well aware that COVID-19 was here and spreading. It was horrific. It is the DNC showing its voters that they really don't care if they live or die. For the record, Bernie Sanders made the right decision this time and told his supporters to stay home. And I applaud him for this, although my God, what a sadly low bar. This specific tragedy of bad decision-making was in part due to Republicans as well. Apparently, Republican judges or something rejected the notion from some Democrats to hold off the election. But these are still Democratic Party elections, so ultimately the party could stop the elections if they wanted to. And at this point, there really is only one political party in the United States. The Democrats are more interested in crushing Bernie Sanders than Trump. Both parties are completely bought by corporations. Both parties participate in gross voter suppression. Both parties agree with corporate socialism and with American supremacy and with endless war. I'm not biased in this regard. I look at Democratic Party loyalists the same way as I look at Republican Party loyalists, which are cult-like appeasers of power, either misled or willfully ignorant. The Republicans are elected to do awful things, and the Democrats are elected to stay out of their way, and in some cases, you could even say a lot of cases, help them. It's all sham. The only things they disagree on are moderate differences to immigration and gun control, and granted, some big differences when it comes to abortion. But honestly, that's sort of all they disagree on. Everything else is identity politics. One party is racist and the other one is less racist. We need a workers' movement. We don't need any fucking politicians. We are the ones with the real power. The next subject on current events are a few things related to the COVID-19 pandemic that I wanted to mention. The first is the god-awful prison system in this country. We have loads of prisoners in this country. In fact, more than any country, and by a lot. No country even really comes very close to how many prisoners we have in the United States, even though we aren't the most populated. There are 2.3 million prisoners in this country, and they're being more or less ignored in this outbreak, even though they're going to get hit maybe the worst in this pandemic out of our entire population. But our society and government can't be bothered to pay for the legal fees of getting people released. They can't be bothered to pay for improved sanitation. They can't be bothered to pay for less crowded prisons to begin with. They can't be bothered to buy the staff more medical equipment or personal protective equipment. It's also not a coincidence that we have a lot of for-profit prisons as well as slave labor within the prison system of this country at the same time that we have the largest prison population on the planet. They have a profit incentive to have as many prison cells occupied at any given time as possible. There is money in keeping prisons full. There isn't any money in letting any prisoners go. It's not too complicated. It all comes down to making fucking money. Capitalism has really ruined our ability to handle this entire pandemic in almost every way. Profit is not interested in public health because the fact of the matter is that we have a lot more supplies in this country and a lot more sanitation supplies. So we have a lot more medical supplies and sanitation supplies than we are currently aware of. And this is because so much of it is in private hands. There are doctors who are going online and buying stockpiles of equipment themselves from private companies with their own money. It's there, and so are the resources to start producing these things right now, right here in America, but we don't do it because none of these things have anything to do with profit. They only will spend money in our interest if they really believe they have no choice. And that includes spending money on all of the brave doctors and nurses that all of these politicians are calling heroes, while at the same time, some of them are re-wearing masks for days on end because the system is still only giving them crumbs in return for being so-called heroes. They get accused of stealing masks by our president while they are suffering from a lack of masks. It all really makes me sick. Now, another important subject regarding this global pandemic is another large group of extra vulnerable people when it comes to this global crisis, and that's third world countries. And I'm going to talk about one specifically. But in general, there are certain countries where we are going to see extremely disturbing levels of devastation. Countries such as Nigeria, India, and Haiti. There's an interview in the Gray Zone's Red Line with the host Anya Parampil. I hope I'm saying that right. And she spoke with Dr. Jeb Sprague. I hope I'm saying that right as well, but you guys should check it out at thegrayzone.com. Gray is spelled with an A. And Dr. Jeb Sprague is a research associate at the University of California, Riverside, and he brought up some figures that were disturbing, to say the least, about the situation in Haiti in regarding to the COVID-19 pandemic. So in this interview, the doctor says that it is possible for as many as 800,000 Haitians to die from the pandemic, and their population is only 11.3 million. Make no mistake, these are herd immunity numbers, and there are several reasons that a pandemic is going to take such a steep toll on a country like this. One of them is the lack of medical supplies, and this is due to their lack of capital. Capitalism naturally feeds on the vulnerability of countries such as this. To get a picture of how unprepared they are, the number of ventilators they have is around 64. That's right. 64 for a population of 11.3 million, and a lot of them might not even work properly. What a shameful and grotesque display of disparity that our economic system allows to occur. The other reason this is going to take such a toll is, again, an economic reason. A large amount of the population of Haiti does not have the option of simply sheltering in place. They put food on their plates day to day. So if you look at it from their perspective, it's either quarantine and starve to death or take your chances with the virus. From that perspective, it's an obvious choice, and that is one of the big reasons as to why we are seeing projections of numbers such as this. This is the condition where a population has no choice but to experience the damage that it takes to reach herd immunity like animals. This is disgusting and shameful, and us as humans globally can do better than this. We should all be ashamed of our economic system and moral principles as a country. We should be ashamed that a country in such poverty even exists in the same hemisphere as the wealthiest country on the planet. It is just plain wrong. Haiti is a country that desperately needs help, and it is a country that has needed help before due to devastating hurricanes and earthquakes. You know the country that has been there to help Haiti through these terrible times? Take a guess. It's not America. It's Cuba. Cuba has sent 350 doctors to Haiti in order to help their people with this pandemic. It seems like socialist and communist ideologies are very heavy in solidarity and humanity, which is what our planet needs right now, not only because of this pandemic, but also because of other common struggles, such as climate change and war, which hurt poor people the most compared to anyone. The American people seriously need to wake up, because I know the public opinion of Cuba, for example, in the United States is very low, which is absurd. Cuba is possibly the most generous country in the entire Western Hemisphere and should be seen as a role model when it comes to its foreign policy of helping people that need it. And we should lift the sanctions. The last piece of current events is that Bernie Sanders has dropped out of the race to be the Democratic nominee for President of the United States. Before anything, I want to say that Bernie Sanders has done a lot when it comes to removing the stigma away from the word socialism, so he gets a lot of credit for that, and I supported him. I agreed with his platform, and I really think his policies would have done a lot of good things. I mean, they would have saved a lot of lives and improved countless others. Bernie Sanders inspired a generation of people with his ideas and his grassroots approach to politics. With all that being said, I don't see what the point of his campaign was this time, seeing how he didn't appear motivated to take on the establishment. He made a movement, generated a ton of grassroots energy, and then he did absolutely nothing of substance with it. He is going to endorse Joe Biden. He sort of already has, and I'll say it again. He is not a leader. And it hurts me to say it, but people like Bernie Sanders are part of the problem. Can someone tell me the last time he called out a corrupt Democrat by name? Has he ever actually stood up to Chuck Schumer? Did he ever stand up to Obama? The main reason I am upset with the Bernie Sanders campaign to begin with is because he used the revolutionary language. But the fact of the matter is that he was bullshitting us. He was not even close to being a revolutionary, and it's really insulting because there are so many Americans that are so desperate for change right now that are hurting, and the Sanders campaign was a vacuum sucking away the hope for change. You can't say you are a revolutionary, but then pretend like the problem with our country is Donald Trump and the GOP. That's too short-sighted. No shit, they are a problem, but that ain't revolutionary talk. Revolutionary language would be explaining the situation for what it is. The difference between these two corrupt cesspools of parties are nothing but arbitrary. Bernie Sanders is simply another piece to this fucked up theater of American electoral politics, and it took me a long time to see this for what it is, which again is theater. He would rather not be hated by the establishment than actually change this country for the better. And honestly, it is fucking pathetic. His entire movement has resulted in a whole lot of energy and enthusiasm burned and wasted before our eyes. And I've heard people say the exact opposite. I disagree. If you see someone crash and burn as hard as Bernie did, and how stacked the establishment was against him, plus the lack of him fighting, made it seem like it's impossible for us to actually elect anyone that's going to fight for us. But that's not true. His campaign was amazingly weak. To say that your opponent has the ability to beat Trump in the general election, Bernie Sanders said that Joe Biden can beat Trump. No campaign, no campaign in politics, when you're primarying someone, would you say that if you're serious about fucking winning? Electoral politics is not going to save us. We have the power. The workers of this country need to unite and demand change that Bernie Sanders was incapable of demanding. We can't expect DC to fix our problems. We need to fix DC directly. So, for the concluding part of the podcast, I'm going to confront the sentiment that socialism is an immoral ideology and also the violent nature of capitalism. Usually, the argument that socialism is immoral is made along with pointing out how many people starved in China and the Soviet Union, as well as the political violence and the repression of human liberties. Now, these were real problems that these countries had, but it's important to analyze why and how these problems came about. And if you're going to be so bold as to pin these problems on Marxist economic theories, I would like to hear some specifics, which I, for one, have never heard. The most glaring problem with these countries in their claims of communism was that the concept of workers owning the means of production was never achieved in these countries. For example, in the Soviet Union, they replaced the owning class with the government class. And this is antithetical to Marxist values. Now, I'm not saying that the Soviet Union was not a socialist system. It was, to an extent. I'm just saying that the major failings of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, although that government is still alive, I mean, when I say failings, I specifically mean the starving and political violence and repression. These were not failures of Marxist ideology as a whole. And these are just not models for a socialist system that I would ever advocate for in the United States, due to the fact that the historical context and material conditions warrant a better, more sustainable system. Also one with far more liberty. And we are industrialized. We have an incredibly productive working class. And we have the benefit of being able to learn from the mistakes made in these socialist systems that have existed before us. Another important factor for these socialist systems is the United States. We have been invading and overthrowing socialist systems since the Russian Civil War that followed the Revolution of 1917, and probably even before that. And here, I am going to play devil's advocate really quick, since I feel like it's a useful exercise. I've heard free market capitalists make the argument that due to the failure of socialist systems in the 20th century, socialists are crazy for wanting to try it again. This is the argument that socialism has been proven to be a dysfunctional economic system time and time again. My response to this would be another question, which would be, what part of communist ideology caused all of these failures? Explain the systematic contradictions in a communist system that will result in it not working. I still have never been given an answer to this response that did not involve strawmanning socialist beliefs and calling it, just authoritarian. I, for one, can explain the fundamental reasons that in our global capitalist system, around 25,000 people a day starve to death on this planet, where we waste enough food to feed everyone. And it's because food distribution is driven by profit, not driven by feeding people. This is a tragedy that happens every day, every minute, because of the contradictions and perverse incentives of capitalism. This simply is not the case for the tragedies that happened to China and in the Soviet Union. Yes, there are things to learn in the mistakes, but the mistakes were simply not because of communist ideologies. And to argue against socialism by giving body counts is ignorant as hell. You can fairly attribute not only starvation, but colonialism and imperialistic warfare and poverty as all results of the global capitalist system. You can link all of those things to profit and the systematic flaws of capitalism, and all of those things have killed untold numbers of people. Capitalism is so violent upon our natural environment that we can't even afford to keep it going. We had social democracy in the United States less than 100 years ago, and look at us now. All of it undermined by corruption. And capitalism makes corruption, enables it. Capitalism is the problem, and we will always be fighting the contradictions of the system until we finally decide to evolve past it. I mean, seriously. Bernie Sanders was a social democrat, not even a socialist, and look at how they treated him. They were not going to let him win for a second. Capital concedes nothing. That is why we need a revolution of workers, and we need it to be a socialist revolution. It does not need to be violent, but historically, that is up to the owning class and whether or not they are willing to concede their ownership. And I say this only because our planet cannot afford to wait any longer. We can't afford to take no for an answer. It is socialism or barbarism, and this $2.2 trillion stimulus bill Congress passed is effectively a corporate coup. So we are out of time. That massive handout to the corporate state in the midst of an economic depression is going to have extremely severe consequences for the everyday person over the next decades. We will see our power as workers and our power as consumers shrink to a level that we have never seen. This was a robbery on the great people of this country, and we can't sit by any longer. If we do, the violence of capitalism in the sense of pollution, warfare, and aggressive means of control is going to kill us all. That's all for this week. Thanks so much for listening, and hopefully I'll see y'all next week. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and look out for each other.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Patriotic Communist. All of the music you heard in this podcast was produced and performed by me, Max Rice, and if you would like to check it out, just search Max Rice on any streaming platform. That's MAXRICE. Yes, like the food rice. This is Max Rice signing off.
We're all distracted by media. The misdirection of attention benefits big powers I mentioned. Y'all try to lessen questions and attentions. Money equals power. We gotta kill this connection. These force-fed concepts make no sense. How y'all hating immigrants and we controlled by the 1%. Zombified by screens. Dehumanization comes easily. All I hear are American supremacists, but this line of thought is a normality, full of fallacies while we stay combative overseas. Laws and moral laws, as far as I can see, and no one cares because of the mass distractions. We're expected to not question how the government uses our taxes unless it's helping people. Then they ramble like that's all to see. Though we need to free the people, we need a fucking hero. We need some MLK, FDR style of change. We're full of pain and ignorant, but won't live in fear. Though we need some yellow vest, bulletproof vests and bold claims. We need that fire in our hearts that can't be tamed. We need to reject and correct our collective violent actions, but it won't happen. Fuck. We're all distracted.